Guyana, of rivers and plains, made rich by the sunshine and lush by the rains. Say a gem light and fair between mountains and seas, your children salute you, dear land of the free land of Guyana, our heroes of yore, both bondsmen and free, laid their bones on your shore. This soil so they hallowed, and from them are we all sons of one mother, Guyana, the great land of
And welcome to Globespan Television here in New York City. We are broadcasting live to all our viewers in the Caribbean and beyond, Latin America, North America, and around the world. Tonight, our guest is Mr. Carl Greenidge. He is the government agent on the border controversy. But before we get to him, I want all of you to know that this program is being made available by Mr. Noir Singh and by Mr. Devin Bissoon and Mr. Ryan Gobin, our two technical directors. We also want to let you know that we are a fair and balanced network, meaning that we will invite anyone to come on the program from whichever political stripes or religious or whatever it is. Everyone will give them free access to get on this program, providing there's an important topic to discuss. And the views expressed tonight are solely those of our guests and not those of the staff or management of Globespan Television. Tonight, we'll discuss the border controversy, Venezuelan incursion into Guyana, and what's the next steps Guyana has taken to at least alleviate that problem. So, Mr. Greenidge, good night and welcome to Globespan Television.
Good evening, Dr. Rose, and may I say a good evening and greetings to all of your viewers this evening, and thank them for joining us. It's an important issue for me.
I want our viewers to know that last week Mr. Greenidge was here, but we had some technical difficulties, so we had to cancel the program. So tonight we'll start afresh, hoping that everything goes well. So, Mr. Greenidge, my first question to you. Were you surprised, or anyone within your group surprised, of Maduro's incursion into Guyana's territory? I think it was last month.
Yes, very, very little surprises us from Venezuela's end. They seem to have set out to perhaps do the unpredictable. And for example, you'll see in the exchanges in which each side tries to explain what was taking place or what has been taking place, you will probably be taken aback by the undiplomatic language, the rudeness, and the characteristics which our colleagues on the other side demonstrate, which are really not typical of Venezuelan culture. But that is how they feel they need to behave. So we are prepared for a lot of this behavior.
Some believe that Venezuela's threat to Guyana escalated after President Trump imposed more sanctions on Venezuela just about a week or two before. Does your group have that belief as well?
Well, we don't have a view on this. At least I didn't sense from colleagues, because a lot of the things that Venezuela has done are uncalled for. This whole exercise we're looking at is astonishing. A country which has never had sovereignty over 74% of another country suddenly not only fights a case for that 74%, but is in the process of writing a history that is entirely concocted. It is in the process of passing laws to give effect to their whims, and it is in the process of organizing allies and their military forces to intimidate, if not to attack and harm a neighbor. And this country and its leaders speaks about brotherhood, friendliness, and the like. So this is why we look at Venezuela's behavior and reserve a position on what they might have intended or what they intend and what is happening. It is highly unsatisfactory and quite distasteful in many senses.
President Maduro had asked for a meeting with President Ali, but President Ali rightfully rejected such meeting. But are there any discussions at the sub-levels with Venezuela?
There are no discussions taking place as far as I'm aware. And the reason, I would go further than the president to say that Venezuela believes that by a combination by a combination of bluster, erratic behavior, and military force, Guyana can be intimidated into giving up territory that has always been, or at least since 1648, has been in Guyana's control. And when you meet with Venezuela, there's only one story they want to speak about. When are you going to concede and give over to them all or most of their Essequibo? And this makes meeting with them for anything pertaining to the controversy or related matters ridiculous, because we are not in a position to acquiesce to that demand, and there's no justification for it. And when you say you meet them on this, you give rise to expectations both in Venezuela and elsewhere that somehow Guyana is now prepared to deal with that problem. I don't think there's a government in sight in Guyana that has any possibility of making such a concession to Venezuela.
The United States has warned Venezuela that should it repeat its incursion, there will be dire consequences. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Guyana, I think, during last week, and he reinforced that statement. Should we breathe a little sigh of relief that the United States will come to our aid or come to, or assist us? Should Venezuela attempt it to?
Yes, well, Venezuela has done things, been doing things in recent times, which has in a way forced the United States to have to speak to them harshly. I don't know why it should have been necessary in the first instance. The world has for the longest while frowned on, legislated against the acquisition of territory by another country by military bullying or by dint of military force. And why Venezuela should think this is an acceptable way to proceed, I don't know. So the US, although it hadn't been saying much in the past, it is not my impression that the United States would have sat 5 years ago or 20 years ago and watched Venezuela troops march across the borders to seize all or part of the Essequibo.
Now, has the Ghana government engaged other countries in South America, for example, Brazil, Argentina, etc.?
Well, of course, Guyana has been working on the countries around the world, different degrees of intensity. And you asked specifically about Brazil. Brazil is a major regional power and a global power, but also a major regional power. And of course, the Guyana government would have had to engage Venezuela, Brazil in respect of this matter to do with Venezuela.
President Maduro plans to hold elections in Essequibo, I think is April 25th of this month, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, correct.
So how that election will go, he will be asking Guyanese to vote to elect the governor.
No, there's no question of him asking Guyanese, just as was the case with the referendum.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that the plan is to have, if there is any voting at all, and you know the last set of voting he had, the estimated number of votes cast, ballots cast, seem to not approximate to the real numbers involved. So
Well, for the referendum, was only 10% of the people voted.
well, there you go. There you go. In this case, no areas, no constituencies have been defined, so we don't know what these people are voting for in terms of geographical representation, who the governor's aides or governor's associates or the other persons to be elected, what specific areas they are covering, they're responsible for. So that is that's the reality. And whether he is actually going to have an election is somewhat doubtful. El Tiempo, which publishes something called tiempo.com, a couple of weeks ago, had a piece that says the PSUV, that's the political party in office, will choose candidates for governor for Essequibo by consensus. Well, I wasn't clear what that meant. And in reading it, what they are saying is that there may just be, for example, in the case of the governor, there may just be one candidate. And in the case of the deputies, there may not be a competition amongst them. In other words, somebody may sit down in a room in Caracas and just put a pen against 30 or 40 names and say, these are the people that have been elected by overwhelming consensus. So I'm not sure that there will be anything of an election. And certainly, just as no constituencies have been defined, there has been no, and there can be no either electioneering or dissemination of information pertaining to those who are to be elected. So there's no electoral schedule. No electoral schedule has been distributed, and it is the case in the very paper that I mentioned to you. They're arguing that this process is unclear. Although the elections will be held at that time, they were saying on the 27th. Now it is said it will be the 25th, but no schedule associated with it.
The Guyana government has asked the International Court of Justice, ICJ, to block the elections in Essequibo that Venezuela plans to hold. Where that case lies, has the ICJ responded?
Yes, the ICJ has responded to the two invitations we sent them for pertaining to this matter, and anytime now, sometime between, let us say, today and the middle of the week, we expect the court, or let's say the end of the week, we expect the court to respond to the request that we have sent. We will not,
So the court will respond by the end of this week.
I would think so.
And do you think they will block the elections? They will tell Venezuela not to go ahead, or they'll...
I would be so bold as to assume that the case that we have made is such that it fits with the previous complaint we have made. The court, whilst it might have had some doubt as to whether the Venezuelans were serious, they now are sure that the Venezuelans are serious. But more importantly, since they have defied the court's order to desist from acting on the basis of the referendum that they were to hold, I believe that the court will recognize that its authority is being challenged and the rule of law is being cast out by Venezuela on the basis that they are Venezuelans, and Mr. Maduro has the last say on all matters as to do pertaining to international rule of law. The court, I think, will not be left with much option.
Now, the border controversy is in the ICJ's hands. Where is that case right now? When do we expect a ruling? Guyana, I think, submitted its portion of the memorial as Venezuela supply, give them theirs.
Can I ask you to allow me to show you a couple of things on the screen?
Go ahead.
And what I'm going to show you is the process.
Okay.
That the court engages in, and it's important for me to show you the process in writing, as it were, because there are many steps involved, and I think people tend to lose track. People tend to lose track of those steps. Basically, there it goes. Basically, the screen sharing started. This is the simplest way I can show you the process. Okay, you will see ICJ process, and under it says stages. Guyana has instituted proceedings, and the court is obliged by its rules to make a decision on jurisdiction. That's what I call jurisdiction phase. And that phase has been completed. Although Venezuela insists that it does not recognize the court, Venezuela signed the Geneva Agreement. And the Geneva Agreement, which I've had great pleasure in distributing to people who have been attending our meetings. The Geneva Agreement specifically makes mention of judicial proceedings, and that in choosing the means, which are about 7 means, and which include judicial proceedings, those means are to be chosen if the two sides can't agree, and we've never agreed on anything. If Venezuela and Guyana cannot agree, from a list that runs something like this: negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and judicial settlement, and resort to regional agencies or arrangements. If the countries can't agree, then the Secretary General chooses the next phase. The Secretary General chose judicial settlement. And the highest international court responsible for judicial settlements, disputes between states, is, of course, the International Court of Justice. So that decision was taken, and however much Venezuela may complain, they can't appeal that decision. So the court moved to the next phase, and the next phase is called the merits phase. That is where you argue the merits of your case, as would happen in a court. Venezuela had that phase in effect suspended. It started with a presentation of a memorial by Guyana. Guyana presented a memorial. The Venezuela lodged preliminary objections, and the court looked at those preliminary objections, which in effect was saying, well, this process cannot go forward without Britain. Of course, they were hoping that they could mobilize international opinion against Guyana by saying Britain was an imperialist and it is Venezuela versus the imperialists, Venezuela versus Exxon. Of course, in arguing that, they don't like to mention that Exxon accounts for 65% of the share of the enterprise in the Stabroek block, and that Hess, and more importantly for our discussion here, CNOOC, the Chinese overseas petroleum company, accounts for the balance. So this is an absurdity where you only see and you only mention the partner involved in the exercise who you regard as undesirable or your enemy, when in fact Exxon and no less CNOC are beneficiaries of this project. They get money from it, they get oil from it, they get access to resources, and that is what should be reflected. So whilst they tried to say, well, Britain should be involved, the court said no, Britain was aware when it signed the Geneva Agreement, just as Venezuela was aware, that Guyana could choose to represent itself and make its own arrangements for representation without Britain. And that is what the court decided. Now, by way of a further attempt to delay the process, Venezuela instituted what are called provisional measures. And those provisional measures, Guyana, drew the court's attention or asked the court to institute provisional measures in November of 23. And those provisional measures had to do with the referendum that Venezuela passed. And the court acted on it expeditiously, as I hope they will do so in the other complaints regarding indication of provisional measures. And by December, they had given us a response to this complaint. And that is where it stood. The court responded quickly on that one and said that Venezuela could not change or shouldn't be doing anything to change the constitutional standing of Essequibo vis-a-vis Guyana. And we hope that on the other two measures before the court, including the one you mentioned, action taken in the region of the Cuyuni and action taken in relation to the vessels operating on the shelf in the development of the oil sector, one would hope that the court will also act expeditiously on those matters.
Well, let me just interrupt you there for a second. Venezuela objected to Guyana's presentation or Guyana's memorial, which is Guyana's case. Guyana responded to Venezuela's objection. Now, my question to you is this. So Guyana's memorial has been accepted by the ICJ. Has Venezuela submitted their memorial, in other words, their case to the ICJ as yet, or their side of the case?
I try for purposes of exposition to keep these things separate.
Okay.
I will come back to the memorial and the response to the memorial in a second. I just wanted you to know that the action by the court on the memorial proper, in other words, the merits, the arguments as to whether we are right or whether Venezuela's fabrications are accepted by the court, that leads to, if you like, a suspension of consideration of issues pertaining to the merits. So at this point in time, Guyana has submitted a memorial to the court. The court had requested Venezuela to supply a response. Venezuela supplied a response in November, what we call a counter memorial. Okay? And so that counter memorial has gone to the court, and we are in a position to we were in a position to respond to that. Venezuela, in turn, is going to have an opportunity later this year. I think it's actually in
Okay, if I got
we have sent
a rejoinder. Okay. And when
rebuttal our rebuttal has already been submitted to Venezuela, and Venezuela's
response,
rejoinder will be 11th of August.
The 11th of August
Yes.
this year.
Yes.
Okay. So when do you expect the court to rule on the case officially once and for all?
Okay. Because you're not sure what other tactics Venezuela may successfully employ to delay the decision of the court, I don't really guess would be 6 months or 9 months, 6 to 9 months after August. All right? So very early in 2026. However, it is still possible that Venezuela may come up with other delaying tactics. Okay? And insofar as Venezuela is defying the court by doing things that attempt to preempt the decision of the court, such as, for example, having an election or sending warships to disrupt the work of the oil companies, we may respond with indication of provisional measures, asking the court for indication of provisional measures. And insofar as we do that, we may find it delays the process.
I want you to explain to our viewers, our listeners, why does the court take so long? Guyana has sent a request asking them to block the elections. They said a ruling should come out next week. But Guyana sent a request almost about a month ago. So why the ICJ, International Court of Justice, is taking so long to act? What's the reason for that?
Well, as you know, this is not a municipal court. First of all, it has an agenda. We are not the only case. And insofar as they have to respond to an urgent request and provisional application, indication of provisional application is urgent, I can say, whilst the overall process has taken very long, that the response to the request for indication of provisional measures has been prompt. They've responded to these requests in a very short space of time. But of course, you're dealing with international law, and you're dealing with a case that now has been complicated. If, for example, you bear in mind that there are rules specific to that provisional measures, they have to pull their lawyers together. They have to pull the members of the court together to exercise their minds over what laws are applicable, what rules, what problems may come back from the two parties and so forth. As regards what they're dealing with now, I don't think we have a complaint as regards speed.
Based on what you know, the information you got, and based on the case, do you think Guyana has put forward a very, very strong case?
Well, Guyana's put forward an exceptionally strong case, and the reason why Venezuela is refusing to accept the jurisdiction of the case has nothing to do with the excuses that Venezuela has provided. I can say to you that, well, the lawyers have their own view as to how strong the case is, and of course our lawyers tell us that our case is exceptionally strong. But as a layman, looking at the case, looking at the history and listening to the work of the historians on this matter, it is very clear that Venezuela has not only a very weak case, but that is why they are unwilling to subject it to third-party involvement. If you have a case that is as strong as they claim, the Pope gave them the territory, Spain occupied the territory or colonized it, Britain stole it, the world knows that, and it's very clear. Why is it that they took from 1899 until 1962 to draw to the attention of the world that some problem arose in relation to this case? And then, having done that, why is it that up to now, no clear documentation pertaining to the fraud they claim took place has been provided? This has to be documentation which is what you might call forensic. You can't just come with gossip, which is what Severo Maleprevost has provided. You have to show more than coincidence. You have to show deliberate attempts to flout the four points or conditions that are associated with nullity, and they have not been able to do that. Now, the matter is at the merit stage, and Venezuela is still trying to avoid detailed consideration of the merits now as they were trying to do in 1963. 1963 and 66, Guyana met with Venezuela and Britain to look at the complaints they had, and none of the evidence they claimed they had was provided. After that, 4 years of deliberations of the Mixed Commission involving names such as Shirley Field Ridley, Mohammed Shahabuddin, Donald Jackson. These are some of our most experienced lawyers who work in the Caribbean. Venezuela did not submit any meaningful set of information to prove and justify the claim that they were making about nullity. You can't benefit from an award by a court. You don't like the award, you decide it is null and void, and then you are entitled to all the benefits that you had asked for before the court pronounced. And you behave as though what has happened is not that you have complained that the award is unfavorable to you, but you behave as though you have been given the award. That is what is confronting us. That is what makes the matter so absurd. And I think it is hard for the court to believe that this is what Venezuela is doing. You have objected to a decision. You have tried to get Guyana to speak to you, not about the decision, about handing over the territory as though you won the decision. And when they wouldn't do it, you turn your army on them, as happened in 1970, It happened again in 2015. And they were threatening to do the same thing at the end of 2023 and in 2024. And we are now back to a situation in which, if you look at the videos, you will see the goodly president of Venezuela threatening all sorts of things if he doesn't get his way. And in the process, arguing points which are completely false. For example, 2 or 3 days ago, I was sent a video being broadcast by Mr. Maduro, being admired by his vice president, arguing that Simon Bolivar had fought for the freedom of Essequibo. He was not given it by colonialists, and I agree with that, but that he gave Venezuelan blood and bullets to win Essequibo. Complete falsehood. The man Simon Bolivar died in 1830. And by the time he died, places such as Bartico were already established. Many other parts of the Essequibo were already in our hands. And you will remember that the revolution in Berbice, triggered by
Coffee.
behavior of slavery in,
Coffee.
that's right, took place since 1763. We didn't have to wait for some Spaniards to come and free us. In 1823, several thousands, 20-odd thousand slaves, as commemorated in Georgetown here, descended on the capital, and many of them were murdered. I know of no Spaniard involved there. Venezuela wasn't independent, so it couldn't have been involved. Spain was not involved. Spain has never claimed it was involved. In 1834, when Damon was mobilized the 700 and odd slaves to protest the failure of the British, not the failure of the Spaniards, not the failure of Venezuela, but the failure of the British to give the slaves their freedom, which he thought that Queen Victoria had sanctioned. He was taken and hung at the place that we call the National Assembly, was hung in the grounds of the Parliament. I am aware, and we have no evidence, of not a single Venezuelan there. In other words, the slaves, together with others who were with us, Amerindians of various constituencies of Guyana, including as far afield as the Cuyuni, fought for the freedom that Guyana enjoys today. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Venezuelans. And those Venezuelans who believe that by virtue of them fighting to liberate Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and wherever else, they are entitled to be celebrated in the same way, or to have other territory ascribed to them. They are mistaken. They are in an illusion. They didn't contribute to the freedom of the people of Guyana, not in any way whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I will go so far as to remind you that in 1823, when Bolivar was alive and he was fighting for the freedom, or the independence, I should say, for the independence of Venezuela from Spain, and then Venezuela and Colombia, for example, it was a British volunteer force, what the British call a legion, a foreign legion, that joined to help Venezuela to fight the Spaniards. And today, 100 and something years later, 102 years later, you hear, or 200 years later, sorry, you hear men fabricating stories about, rather than telling you the story about how the British helped them, telling stories about how Simon Bolivar and his merry men helped to free the people of Guyana. In fact, the people of Guyana would have been completely crazy to join Bolivar. Bolivar, before he died, and by the time of his death, was governing a country that still recognized slavery. So the Africans of Venezuela were not freed until 1854. Why would they join Venezuela? As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting tale about Simon Bolivar's deputy, who was born in the Dutch Caribbean. This is the deputy as a general. And he was very unhappy with how Bolivar and his men were treating the mulattoes and the blacks in the army. And for his complaints, for his trouble, Bolivar had him shot for treason. And this is the country that comes to Guyana and goes to the Caribbean islands and tells them about how Venezuela fought for the freedom of the Caribbean. Well, they may have done it for St. Vincent. I'm not aware, but they certainly didn't do it for Guyana. And I'm sure that the same applies to the other Caribbean territories. And it certainly doesn't justify Venezuela laying claim to the exclusive economic zones of these Caribbean territories.
My next question to you is this, and it came from one of our listeners, and I want to tell our listeners that I can only ask so many questions from them. Now, the 1899 award, arbitrary award, that's 126 years ago. Venezuela still refused to accept that. The Geneva Conference, 1960.
I wouldn't say still refuses. And I'm objecting, I'm interrupting you in the same way that I interrupt some of the North American and Venezuelan people who say the dispute of 1899 that the arbitral tribunal was looking at has still not been resolved. In fact, Venezuela accepted the decision of the arbitral panel. It accepted it until 1963. So what you have, and that is why we had the issue of whether it's a dispute or not, what you had was a dispute was resolved by way of arbitration. Venezuela accepted it for over 63 years, and in that time refused to modify anything, even where there were mistakes in the geography. They refused. And now you will find 63 years later, they woke up, discovered that there were resources there that they liked. And therefore, they are now refusing to accept the award. But the Venezuelan parliament, the Venezuelan president, the Venezuelan administration accepted the award. They ratified the agreement. They confirmed the borders in 1905. They were agreed in 1899. Agreed. MacTurk, which is a name I'm sure you know, was one of the people that participated in the drawing up of the boundary. In 1905, Venezuela's team signed the agreement. In 1928 and earlier, Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil embarked on an agreement to identify the common border point on Mount Roraima, where the three borders met. So based upon the fact and the assumption that Venezuela had accepted the agreement, Brazil now signed an agreement with us. And you're telling me, as a Venezuelan, the Venezuelans are telling me they didn't accept the agreement. They accepted it to the extent that even a third country has used that agreement to define the common borders between the three countries. This is not a joke, and you can't wake up a morning and decide, well, I don't like that agreement anymore. It is an international treaty. And three sets of borders are based on that.
As you said, okay, I'll accept that. Venezuela did accept, but Maduro now don't want to acknowledge that. And in the 1963 and 1967 Geneva Conference,
66
They
Geneva Convention. Yeah.
66. They agreed to it, and now Maduro is rejecting all of that. And most recently, the Argyle Declaration. He agreed not to use force or to encourage
Yes.
to get into Guyana's water and so forth. And he broke that declaration, the promise of that as well. So I'm saying to you, if the ICJ should rule in Guyana's favor, Maduro will not accept the ICJ's decision. And
Well,
if he doesn't, what other recourse Guyana has?
okay. Well, the ICJ is not an arbitral panel.
Right.
And whilst an arbitral panel makes decisions that are binding, because the parties involved in arbitration have to commit themselves beforehand to the decision being binding. In 1897, under the Washington Convention, Venezuela, Guyana, and Britain, or Venezuela and Britain, signed an agreement saying the decision of the arbitral panel will be final, it will be binding. Now, they're claiming that the award itself was illegal. The court has to decide not on where the line runs in the maritime zone. They have to decide whether the panel's decision is binding. Whether, in other words, the specific question they were asked to look at by Guyana, is the award valid? And there are a number of things follow from it. If the award is valid, then it is the court and the UN's responsibility to enforce the agreement. And these are the specific things we identified in our memorial that went to the court, saying if the award is valid, then can you just confirm that Venezuela has obligations? The obligations in 1899 and 97 are still obligations that they have to honor. That is what they're faced with. And that is why they've been making all this noise about not wanting to go to court. The court is not fair. Let me take a little diversion to say something to you, to your audience. Have a look at the judges on the panel. The court has a panel of 16, okay? 16 judges. And the judges are selected on the basis of representation from all corners of the world. I'm going to ask again my assistant to put it up on the board. But what I want to say to you is this. If you look at the panel of judges, number one is President Isamu Yuji of Japan. He is now the president. That's a new president, okay? 3rd of March, 2025, he's become the president. So the court is a little different from what it was when it was looking at the other elements of such as jurisdiction, which went to it. She's a different set of persons. The question of bias, therefore, shouldn't arise. That's one of the reasons why it shouldn't arise. I want to say to you that every single region of the world is represented on the court. Every single region. You're seeing a Japanese chairman. Immediately after that, the vice chairman is from Uganda. The next in line is Judge Peter Tomka, who's active and asked all sorts of difficult questions. Judge Ronnie Abraham of France, who in one case didn't support Guyana's arguments. Judge Yusuf, who is now the president of he is from Somalia. Judge Hangwin of China, okay? You notice that Venezuela chose not to identify a Chinese company as benefiting from exploiting the shelf because they didn't want to criticize the Chinese as benefiting. But they can't deny the fact that there's a Chinese judge, a woman judge on the panel, amongst the panel of 16. You've got a judge called Judge Bandari of India, a distinguished member of the court, like many of the others. Judge Nolt of Germany, Hilary Charlesworth, who they choose to abuse and attack. This was the judge ad hoc for Guyana in the past. Judge Brandt of, guess where? Brazil, South America. South America is represented on the panel. And what is more, the next judge in line is Juan Manuel Gomez Robledo. Okay, this is a Mexican. I'm saying all corners of the globe are represented on this panel of judges, and you can't find, in terms of criticisms or critics of the court, you can't find people arguing, except for Venezuela, that this court is somehow biased. Biased against Venezuela, biased against socialists, biased against those of African descent or Latin culture. You can't say that. You cannot say that. So they're having a difficulty justifying the positions they have taken in the past. And that is why Venezuela continues to avoid embracing the court debate on the merits. They don't want to get around to that. And they're doing all sorts of things. These incursions, for example, are so blatant that they can only be intended to derail the court proceedings. Guyana will complain about them, and when Guyana complains, it takes time, it goes to the court, and the court may, by some miracle, decide that you would turn the case back because Guyana is wrong, or Guyana is misrepresenting the situation. So
are there any judges there from the Caribbean?
There is no judge from the Caribbean, but I should say that there are two judges ad hoc. Where a court does not have a representative of one of the parties, neither from Venezuela nor from Guyana, the court mandates the country to name a judge ad hoc. On the court before February was Judge Robinson, a very famous Jamaican judge, quite a distinguished judge in the context of the Caribbean, and globally acknowledged. And he retired. And in his place, you had the Brazilian judge, whose name I showed you just now. But today, Judge Wolfram is the judge ad hoc.
From Venezuela?
No, for Guyana, Judge Rudiger Wolfram. And for Venezuela, the judge is Philippe Couvreur. Now, Monsieur Couvreur is the former registrar of the court.
Okay, okay.
So Venezuela has chosen to engage someone who comes out of the belly of the beast, as it were. And the function of those judges ad hoc is not only to listen to your case, but also to ensure that it is fairly represented in the court. So they're allowed to ask questions and to make comments whilst the court is in session.
Okay. Now, I think Guyana had one justice there, Shahabuddin.
No, not on this court.
No, not in this court, but before.
International
He died.
Criminal
I know
Court.
he died.
Yes, and he was also
So,
chair of the International Criminal Court.
The next round, will the Caribbean have a justice on the court?
Well, there are two criteria. One is that the judge has to be elected.
And who elects a judge?
The region. And then the region submits to the global assembly, if you like. The regions select the judge. And the region of the Caribbean and Latin America select their judges. As I said, you have two from Latin America. And
I
they
want,
represent the
I
Caribbean
want,
and Latin America.
I want to go back to the question I asked you before. If Venezuela refuses to accept the ICJ decision in this border controversy now, will the UN intervene, or will any other country intervene, the United States or any other country?
Well, first of all, if Venezuela refuses not to accept but to implement the decision taken by the court, it is up to the UN Secretary General and Guyana to take the matter to the UN, and this is to the Security Council.
But Russia might vote against it.
It might veto any action you take.
Right.
But a veto of the court decision can't give Venezuela a new border. In other words, we have a border, Venezuela and Guyana, that is born of an arbitral agreement. The arbitral agreement, if it is null and void, it has to be replaced by a new boundary. If it is not null and void, it has to be honored as it stands. If the court, therefore, rules in Guyana's favor, Russia can veto it as much as it likes. A veto does not constitute a new border. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand that, yeah.
It still leaves Venezuela in the difficulty that it can then complain as much as it likes. The border internationally recognized will be the border of 1899. And
so
that was
if Russia vetoes that, there's no new order given there. So the case will still be in limbo, though. Venezuela continue to use threats.
Oh, the court's decision is final.
Yeah, but Venezuela continue to use threats against Guyana.
Well, then it is up to Guyana to mobilize as much as it can to get the Security Council, or in the last resort, the General Assembly, to take a decision to discipline Venezuela. Unlike the process that Venezuela would like, and unlike the process that they tried to replace the Geneva Agreement with, namely the Argyle Agreement, which has no end. There is no resolution offered by the Argyle Agreement. I don't care what Venezuela or the others say. The Argyle Agreement carries you into a cul-de-sac and leaves you there because it doesn't force 10 ALBA countries and CELAC to come to any decision. It doesn't even name a quorum. All it does is to name a permanent chair, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent. He apparently is to be the permanent chair of that exercise. But a permanent chair does not give you a new border. And that's the point I'm coming back to, because that is the issue. If they believe the case, the decision was null and void, you can't solve that problem by blocking the court. You have to have an alternative.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
And there is no such mechanism. This is the highest international court. If it says the matter stands, the decision is valid, you have to live with it. And if you take action against Guyana, military-wise, you run the risk. I mean, we can't speak for any other country, and no country will allow you to say that automatically they will do something. But the point is that the UN's rules treat the bucking of a decision by the ICJ as a threat to peace. And therefore, members of the General Assembly or the Security Council can take action in the face of threats to peace. Even if there's a veto, you have to find a way around that. As I say, you can go to the General Assembly and wherever else. There are a number of measures that can be used. I don't know that they will all be vetoed by Russia.
Okay. Now, so we expect a decision by 2026.
Yes, in 2026.
And you're saying it might delay it because Venezuela could do what?
It may, well, I don't know that one can reasonably expect it to be delayed beyond 2026, but it might be delayed into 2026, maybe March or July or August or whatever. There are many things. I'm not an expert in this matter, but I can tell you that when Kenya found itself losing against as weak a state as Somalia, and when I say as weak a state, I mean Somalia is not a complete state, as you well know. And they were able to go to the court and fight a case and win it against Kenya, one of the strongest countries in Africa, strong in the sense that they have skills. I mean, I worked in Kenya. My first job was in Kenya. Kenya's skills today are, far in excess of what they were when I worked there. Their legal skills, they have outstanding lawyers and so forth. And they lost the case to Somalia because the basic facts were not in their favor. And this is one of the things about the court. And so what they did, they tried to delay. They asked for extensions. And the last extension they asked for was based upon the allegation that they were not properly represented, and they weren't properly represented because they themselves had fired all their lawyers. They had fired a legal team and were asking the court to give them an extended period to recruit and brief a new team. And the court did not accept that. So
the question I was driving at, though, Venezuela could try to delay the case as long as possible.
Yes, they've been doing it all the time.
But the court has the right, and correct me if I'm wrong, to issue a deadline to Venezuela. Well, look, submit all your proposals on this day. And beyond that, we will not accept anything else.
Yes, they are empowered to give a deadline and hold the countries to that deadline.
Okay. So let me take a commercial break and I'll come back to you.
Okay, lovely.
All from onesupplier.com. Folks, listen to this carefully. You can get all your West Indian food and groceries from all from one supplier. Food, roti, fish, curry, meats, whatever you want. You can use your EBT, your credit cards, or your debit cards. And all groceries can be home delivered where any part of in the States. They are located at 108, 109 Liberty Avenue in Richmond Hill. The phone number to call is 718-551-3292. That's 718-551-3292, where you can get all your West Indian food and groceries. So please give them a call or please visit the grocery store there. You can go online, all from one. One is a number, not a letters. 101 supplier.com. And to my favorite, Globespan. Globespan has been in business for more than 30 years, which tells you that they have experience in everything. To book your flights, to book you into hotels, any part of the world you want to go. Globespan will make sure you get there safely and you get all your accommodations ready. They have offices in Guyana, and in Trinidad, as well as in the United States here. It's located at 108, 109 Liberty Avenue in Richmond Hill. And they have upcoming trips going to Dubai, India, South Africa, Norway, and other countries. Rosal Tongue, 337-4287. 337-4287. Georgetown, 227-1701. 227-1701. Shaguna in Trinidad and Tobago, 665-3383. And in Val Park, also in Trinidad, 645-1604. Give them a call wherever you are, and they will get you there as safe as possible. Globespan knows how to do it. When you can't get through in booking your tickets, they will get the job done for you. So again, call Globespan. The number in New York is 718-845-0437. Thanks. So, Mr. Greenwich, let me get back to a very serious topic. We have an embassy in Venezuela, and Venezuela has an embassy in Georgetown. So there are no discussions at that level.
Well, ministers summon ambassadors when they're unhappy with something that the other side is saying.
Right.
But no exchanges are taking place as regards the question of the court or the question of Essequibo.
Well, let me ask you this core question. Do you believe from the bottom of your heart that if the ICJ rules, Venezuela will accept the ICJ decision?
I don't care. I'm saying to you that there are rules which cater for that. You had a case between Nigeria and Cameroon.
Yeah, I know about that case.
Okay, but in the end, Nigeria and its advocates and its leaders who swore on a stack of Bibles that they would never accept the decision handed down by the court, I believe that is a matter that has long been resolved. Nigeria had held that position for a long time.
Right.
Now it has now come off of that particular horse.
But we have trade wars and so forth. Those cases are being settled and countries accept that. But in most cases, when there's a border dispute, it is settled only by wars.
Well, I wouldn't say in most cases. What I would say is that I have seen a range. I don't have it in front of me, but I had a range of the agreements that the court pronounced on and were not accepted by the two parties or three parties involved. But what is your option? If you can't, now look carefully at what has happened in Guyana and Venezuela. There are specified options as regards resolution. As a good lawyer, you know there are about 7 or 8 of these. Negotiation, that's passed. Countries have negotiated and they have concluded nothing. There's been, I suppose you can say, inquiry, because in the UN, prior to embarking on enhanced mediation, undertook some inquiry. You had enhanced mediation rather than normal mediation. You had, I don't think you had formally conciliation, but you had arbitration, 1899. And because the matter was not solved by those methods, it was agreed to go to judicial settlement. And that is the last option that the Secretary General could extract from the list, because the others are in a sense meaningless. You know, why would you go Why would you go to conciliation if you have already gone to arbitration? Normally, arbitration and then judicial settlements are the last. So what is it there? What is it can enable them to resolve this matter? If one country can only be satisfied by having all your territory, there is no resolution unless the other country agrees to give up its territory. Guyana is not going to give up its territory. So there is no point, as Mr. Maduro keeps saying, so we can sort it out by bilateral negotiation. This is nonsense. I'm sorry. Venezuela told the UN that in 2016, and the UN called us, and we went to Whitehaven, I think the place is, spent days. In fact, it was days before Venezuela submitted anything. It was just there. And then when it was submitted, it was clearly absurd. And so everybody saw that. We were not alone. We were at the meeting. The UN was there. The UN has a very large legal department, as you well know. So it wasn't Guyana left on its own or Venezuela on its own. They were trying as much as they could at the level of the UN to find a way around the bottleneck. What are you going to find? You're going to find a means that amounts to, let us say, some form of intervention where an individual acts as a go-between and he carries a proposal from one side to another and the other side modifies it and say, all of that has been done. But as I say, Venezuela, for purposes of becoming a world power, an Atlantic power, will not accept, and I don't know, I maybe didn't show you the maps. I want to show you something. I'll ask again for some assistance from my personal assistant to show you, we're not at the court to deal with maritime matters, but I want to show you something. Because one of the issues that has arisen is a maritime one. And what you're going to be able to see is this. First of all, the map here.
Yeah.
This is the map that Venezuela and the United Kingdom signed in 1905 and in 1909, and that the Venezuelan National Assembly ratified. And we are today in a situation where the Venezuelans are trying to tell the world that the Venezuelan boundary with Guyana ran along this river here. That's the Essequibo River. Now, why is this nonsensical? It's nonsensical because the Dutch capital is located in this river. So if Venezuela controlled Western Guyana, this entire 74% of Guyana, and this was the boundary between the two sides, what general would be mad enough to put the capital in the river, a river that would be controlled by Venezuela and where the land on one side controls the flow of the river? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do understand. Yeah, and I hope our listeners understand.
Yeah, that's a major problem. Venezuela is obsessed with having this piece of land here between the Essequibo and the Orinoco here, because if you give them that river, it enables them to control Demerara here, because you see, Essequibo River runs the length of Guyana.
Yeah.
You can't come to any of these points on this side to the east of the Essequibo River without using the river unless you fly. Essequibo and its tributaries determine all routes to the southeast and southwest of Guyana. All of this is dependent on access via the Essequibo. And that is why Venezuela could not sustain an argument at the arbitral panel that they controlled all of this area because they didn't control the river. The Essequibo River rises in the Acarai Mountains up here, right down here. So it isn't that they seized either the mouth, which obviously they didn't, or the source of the river and therefore controlled all the land here. They did not. The Acarai here, in fact, carries them within a few miles of the borders again with Brazil, and it carries them quite close to Suriname. Now, that's what Venezuela would like. If they have that river, they can exercise strategic control over what would be a rump state, a tiny Demerara and Berbice, and they would have an Atlantic coast. With an Atlantic coast, they can have an EZ. Right now, Venezuela's claim to an Atlantic coast is blocked by the shoulder of South America here. It is blocked by Trinidad and Tobago. And it is blocked by the islands here. So you can't have a 200-mile EZ running this way because the existence of these, to be an Atlantic power, they need to seize Guyana's territory so they have unrestricted access to the Atlantic. And I will go on to remind you that the boundary between Suriname and Guyana, I don't know, can you show us that other map? Okay, you've gone too far. Hold on. Go back a bit. All right. The boundary between Suriname and Guyana is formed by this border here. This is the land, okay? Guyana, Venezuela, Orinoco, Essequibo. The boundary between Guyana and Suriname, this red line was decided by UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, an arbitration panel sat and handed down that award in 2007. And yet, this is the boundary. This is Guyana's side of the boundary. This is Suriname. This is where Venezuela intercepted the Exxon vessel. Look at it. It is 80-odd miles from the Suriname boundary. What does that have to do with Venezuela? Venezuela's capital is way to the west here. Its boundary with Guyana is there. How can its boundary with Guyana be farther west than its boundary with Suriname? So Venezuela is intercepting vessels here, claiming all of this area as their territory because it consists of areas rich in petrocarbon deposits. Venezuela's claim runs into French Guyana, but they can't go and tell the French any nonsense. So they choose Guyana because they can do what they want with Guyana. Guyana is small. You will notice how convoluted their line is. This is the Venezuelan line that forms the basis of Venezuela's EEZ boundary. Okay, it's not complete. It has to be negotiated. Guyana and Venezuela have to negotiate this line. Venezuela in 2011 and 2013 refused to negotiate this boundary on grounds that you need to know what the coast is. Whose coast is this? But this interception here is taking place off of the coast of Berbice. It's about 120 miles from Georgetown. What is Venezuela doing here? What claim do they have here? None. None. Even though they've gone to the trouble Look at this convoluted line. You draw a line between Trinidad and Dutch Islands here. You pass the line between Venezuela and Trinidad. You run it northeast. The angle is less sharp so that it can take in all these areas, such as this one, and further down Suriname. You will have seen in the course of week 4, the last, Block 58. Block 58 is a discovery in Suriname that seems almost as rich in petroleum deposits as the Stabroek Block, which runs this way. It lies just over the line here. Block 58 in Suriname. Venezuela is laying claim to this block. It did so in 2016 when it was laying claim to Stabroek and all of this area. And the Caribbean governments told them to get lost. The other day, I made mention of this at a meeting in 2016 in Barbados, chaired by Barbados Prime Minister. And I made a mistake by saying it was Minister Erskine Sandiford. It wasn't Minister Sandiford, but his successor. And the Prime Minister told Venezuela, this is the Caribbean patrimony and Venezuela should leave it alone. And this was done after the technicians of the Caribbean looked at the maps, and those technicians included Justice Pollard, who is now deceased, but he was one of the experts in this area. The St. Vincent maritime expert was part of that team. And yet Venezuela lays claim to the EZs of something like 8 Caribbean territories plus that of Colombia, which is over here, over this way, over this side. Okay? So you have a problem. I mean, when you have one country deciding it alone must set the rules, and the rules it sets are rules peculiar and beneficial only to that country, you have a difficulty. The world's laws can't be adjusted to just accommodate Venezuela, however nice Mr. Maduro is.
Okay,
So that's the
so
difficulty.
we're coming to the end of the program. It was very, very good of you to make all this very issues very explicit and simple. But I want to rehash on certain things. We will not, Venezuela is yet to produce its final memorial to the International Court of Justice.
The rejoinder, they have to produce
the rejoinder. Okay.
Produce the memorial.
And that rejoinder, Guyana cannot oppose it anymore.
No, it's not that you can't oppose it. Let me say to you that when we looked at the memorial submitted by Venezuela, the lawyers saw something of over 200 pages in length. And when we discussed it with them, thinking that, well, maybe you would have to produce another massive tome for the court, they said no. They wouldn't produce any such thing because the arguments submitted by Venezuela were weak. And much of it is simply a repetition of what had been rejected even in 1899. This is how it runs. They just repeat all arguments. The same things I'm telling you where they claim to have been in places, where they claim that Simon de Bolivar was in places after he died. He was liberating Guyanese slaves from British rule so that they can become Venezuelan slaves. That's the sort of thing. So a lot of it did not warrant any extensive response. And so you don't have to refute every single thing that they submit.
Okay, so you're saying that we're going to get that decision sometime next year,
I hope so.
early or maybe mid-year or so.
Yeah.
And if Venezuela does not apply, Guyana can go to the United Nations Security Council. If the Security Council member vetoes that, it can go to the General Assembly and maybe try to get countries to impose sanctions on Venezuela to comply with the laws. So that's where we stand.
Yes, unless they change their position.
Okay. So that I just want our listeners to understand that. So we have to wait on the courts, international courts decision judgment in 2020, sometime in 2026.
I'm
Mr.
saying
Greenwich?
no, I'm saying more than that. That whilst you wait on the court, and you can't help that, the court, that's how the court works. You have to do your own diplomatic and political work, because
Right.
you can't wait until after the decision to go and talk to enemies, talk to friends, talk to the friends of Venezuela. You have to speak to everybody beginning now.
Okay. Mr. Greenwich, thank you for coming. Thank you very much for being our guest tonight. Your closing remarks.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to explain some of these issues. Some are a little bit contrived and problematic. As I say, we don't really have a difficulty with Venezuela in any court, because we believe Venezuela's case is weak, and much of their evidence that they should have produced to show that, for example, they occupied the 74% of Guyana has not been produced, because they can't produce it. And the evidence that they should have produced from Severo Maleprevo, arguing that there was fraud, or that the court exceeded its boundary and so forth. That has not come forth. It didn't come forth in the 4 years between 1966 and 70. Venezuela didn't take the opportunity of enhanced mediation to deal with this problem in 2017, 2018. And again, at the court, instead of addressing these problems, they're telling you all sorts of crazy things about Venezuela's contribution to Guyana is what accounts for the high level of per capita income of Guyana, because of Venezuela's gifts to Guyana. Now the world can look at that and know it's nonsense. Venezuela today can't retain its own citizens. The inflation in Venezuela is very, very high. The Venezuelan capacity to deliver what it was delivering pre the Chavista regime is a shadow of what it could deliver at that time. So in the meantime, they fabricate a case, and it's not a very good fabrication.
Okay.
Today, more and more in the last few years, Dutch and European researchers have started to publish work on the Dutch presence. And you will find that generating information, for example, on the Creoles of Guyana, the Creole of Essequibo in particular, how heavily dependent it was on the Dutch, the emphasis in it in Dutch, and the extent to which that Creole is unique to Venezuela, and a Creole that you would not going to find elsewhere in the region. So it has given the time for others to do work that supplements what we have done, what we've been saying, and the time that is passing is making us a stronger case for Guyana. Okay, so we are confident.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to make a statement, something affecting my community of Berbice. In all countries, there are good and bad people. In all organizations, there are good and bad people as well. I say this to tell you.
I didn't think there were bad people in Berbice, but I'm surprised to hear you say that. But go on.
Not in Berbice, in all countries. I say this to tell you that the police force in Guyana, there are good cops and road cops. But the
Yes.
good cops far outnumber the road cops by maybe a 20-1 margin or more. But I want to say that Commissioner Clifford Hicken has been doing a very good job in making the force more competent, more responsible, and more accountable. But in Region 6, there seems to be a major problem. And I want the Commissioner and all those commanders to hear this. There are 2 road cops that the people do not trust at all in the quarantine. Their Assistant Superintendent, Laljit, and Assistant Superintendent, Loknot.
You want to mention the name?
I mentioned their names.
Okay.
Because these people take directives from certain people to arrest other people without any evidence. I saw this last weekend, and I saw this before, where people have been arrested. For example, Assistant Superintendent arrested a man for having a toy gun on him and locked him up for almost 2 days. So I'm saying because he received directive from a certain individual who believed that and this individual, I will say this, killed 2 people in traffic accidents of the quarantine, never went to the police station. He gives statements from his home. They went to his home to take statements. That's how powerful he is, or he think he is. And there's another person of 55 Village. She said she controls 51 police station and Skeldon through Assistant Superintendent Laljit. And they will go about arresting people, especially Afro-Guyanese, falsely. I'm asking those in authority to remove these 2 cops from the quarantine, because you can't have police officers at that level and arresting people without any evidence and also accusing them of things that they did not do. That's not justice at all. So I will continue to make this comment until these 2 cops are removed. I'm from the quarantine and I'm worried, because you cannot have someone telling you they control the police officers at 51 police station and at Springlands police station. And that person says she can do anything and no one can arrest her.
Boy.
That is not justice.
And
so
it's a woman.
I'm asking those in authority to remove these 2 cops, Officer Laljit and Officer Luknot, from WIM. That's what I have to say. Now, I want to thank all our sponsors for making this program available, and all our listeners as well who listen attentively to us every Monday night. But most of all, I want to thank Noir Singh for making this program available, and to Devin Bissoon and Ryan Gobin as well, our 2 technical directors. And to you, Mr. Greenwich, I say special thanks to you for being our guest tonight. Because of what happened last week, you were very kind to come back this week and to give a broad explanation of the border controversy and where we stand at this moment. So I hope everyone understood it, and will wait for the timing when the International Court of Justice will issue their judgment, and let's see what happens from there. So thank you again, Mr. Greenwich, and thanks to all our sponsors and all our listeners. Good night to everyone. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.